Robert had always dreamed of living by the water. After 35 years of working in the city, dealing with traffic jams and office politics, he finally had enough money saved up to buy his dream home. When he first saw the small wooden house on Blue Ridge Lake, he knew it was perfect. The house wasn't fancy, but it had everything he needed. Most importantly, it came with a little wooden dock that stretched out into the crystal-clear water. The day he moved in was one of those perfect spring mornings. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the lake was so calm it looked like a mirror. Robert carried his fishing gear down to the dock and sat on the edge, letting his feet dangle in the cool water. For the first time in years, he felt truly peaceful. The neighborhood seemed friendly enough. Blue Ridge Estates was a small community of about 40 homes, most of them occupied by retirees like himself. The houses were spread out nicely with plenty of trees between them. Everyone he met during his first week waved and smiled. It felt like the kind of place where people still knew their neighbors' names. On his third day there, a woman named Patricia knocked on his door. She was probably in her 60s with perfectly styled gray hair and a bright smile. She carried a covered dish that smelled amazing. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, handing him what turned out to be the best tuna casserole he'd ever tasted. "I'm Patricia, the president of our homeowners association. I thought you might like a home-cooked meal while you're getting settled." Robert was touched by the gesture. In his old neighborhood, he barely knew anyone on his street. "That's very kind of you," he said. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" They sat at his kitchen table, looking out at the lake through the big picture window. Patricia told him about the community. There was a book club that met every other Tuesday, an annual 4th of July barbecue, and informal game nights during the winter months. She also handed him a thick folder filled with papers. "These are just our community guidelines," she explained. "Nothing too complicated. We like to keep things looking nice, you know. Basic stuff about lawn care, what colors you can paint your house, that sort of thing." Robert flipped through the pages. Most of it seemed reasonable. "Keep your grass cut. Don't leave trash cans out too long. Get approval before making major changes to your house." He'd lived in neighborhoods with similar rules before. "The most important thing," Patricia continued, "is that we all work together to maintain our property values. This is a special place and we want to keep it that way." Robert nodded. He certainly wanted his investment protected. "I completely understand. I'm not planning any major changes anyway. I just want to enjoy the peace and quiet." "And that beautiful dock of yours," Patricia said, glancing out the window. "How long has it been there?" "According to the previous owner, about 20 years. It's in pretty good shape, though I might need to replace a few boards eventually." "Well, I'm sure everything will work out fine," Patricia said, gathering up her purse. "Don't hesitate to call if you need anything. We're all here to help each other." For the next 2 months, Robert lived exactly the retirement he'd imagined. He woke up early every morning and made coffee while watching the sunrise over the lake. Then he'd grab his fishing rod and spend a couple hours on his dock, usually catching enough bass or trout for dinner. The fishing was better than he'd expected. The lake was clean and well-stocked, and there were plenty of quiet spots where the fish liked to hide. In the afternoons, he worked on small projects around the house. He painted the kitchen, fixed a loose step on the front porch, and planted a small garden beside the driveway. His neighbors often stopped to chat when they walked by. Most of them were friendly people who, like him, had moved here to enjoy their golden years in peace. The evenings were his favorite time. He'd sit on his dock with a cold drink and watch the sun set behind the trees on the far shore. Sometimes other residents would be out on the water in their boats or kayaks, and they'd wave as they passed. The whole scene felt like something from a postcard. Robert also discovered that his dock was the perfect spot for reading. The gentle lapping of the water against the wooden posts was incredibly relaxing. He'd bring out a lawn chair and lose himself in mystery novels or biographies, occasionally looking up to watch an eagle circle overhead or a family of ducks paddle by. The only other activity, on his part of the lake, came from a few neighbors who occasionally used the small beach area about 50 yards from his dock. Kids would build sandcastles there on weekends, and sometimes adults would set up chairs and have informal gatherings. Robert didn't mind at all. The laughter and conversation added to the pleasant atmosphere. He even started making friends. His next-door neighbor and retired teacher named Bill shared his love of fishing. They'd often sit on Robert's dock together in the early morning, sharing coffee and comparing notes about which lures worked best. Bill had been in the neighborhood for 8 years and knew all the best fishing spots. "You picked a great place," Bill told him one morning, as they watched a great blue heron hunting in the shallows. "This lake has been good to all of us. Clean water, good fishing, peaceful neighbors. Can't ask for much more than that." Robert couldn't agree more. After decades of city living, he'd found his slice of paradise. The stress of his old life seemed like a distant memory. His blood pressure had dropped. He was sleeping better, and he felt more relaxed than he had in years. He especially loved the sense of privacy his dock provided. While the community areas were nice for socializing, having his own space on the water felt special. It was his place to think, to reflect on his life, and to simply enjoy the natural beauty around him. The house itself was comfortable but simple. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a cozy living room with a stone fireplace, and that wonderful kitchen with the big window overlooking the lake. Robert had downsized considerably from his suburban house, but he didn't miss the extra space. Everything he needed was right here. As summer approached, Robert felt like he'd made the best decision of his life. The lake community was everything he'd hoped for, and his daily routine of fishing, reading, and relaxing had become deeply satisfying. He even started thinking about maybe getting a small boat next year, though the dock provided everything he needed for now. Little did Robert know that his peaceful new life was about to be turned upside down. The same community that had welcomed him with casseroles and friendly waves was about to challenge everything he thought he knew about his lakefront paradise. Robert was enjoying his morning coffee on the dock when he heard his doorbell ring. It was barely 8 o'clock, earlier than most neighbors usually stopped by. He walked back to the house, still holding his coffee mug, and opened the front door to find a young man in a postal uniform holding an official-looking envelope. "Certified mail for Robert Chen," the postal worker said, holding out his electronic clipboard. "Need you to sign here." Robert's stomach dropped a little. In his experience, certified mail was never good news. He signed for the letter and watched the postal truck drive away before tearing open the envelope. The letter was printed on official Blue Ridge Estates HOA letterhead, and the tone was nothing like Patricia's friendly welcome visit. The letter was formal and cold. It stated that the HOA board had conducted a comprehensive review of waterfront facilities and determined that all private docks needed to be brought into compliance with new community standards. Robert read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what it meant. According to the document, his dock was now considered non-conforming and would need to be removed within 60 days. But that wasn't the worst part. The letter went on to explain that the HOA was implementing a new community waterfront enhancement project. Every lakefront property owner would be required to contribute $15,000 toward the construction of a centralized marina and community dock system. The project, the letter claimed, would ensure equal access to waterfront amenities for all residents while maintaining aesthetic consistency throughout the community. Robert sat down heavily in his kitchen chair, the letter shaking in his hands. $15,000 was a huge chunk of his retirement savings, and they wanted him to tear down his perfectly good dock, the same dock that Patricia had admired just a few months ago. He immediately called the HOA office number listed at the bottom of the letter. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. "Blue Ridge Estates HOA, this is Karen speaking." "Hi, this is Robert Chen on Lakeview Drive. I just received a letter about my dock, and I think there might be some mistake." "Oh yes, Mr. Chen, I've been expecting your call. All waterfront property owners received the same notice yesterday. The new regulations were approved by the board last month, but I wasn't notified about any meeting or vote. Don't property owners get to participate in decisions like this? The board has the authority to make decisions that benefit the community as a whole. If you'd like to discuss the matter further, you can schedule an appointment with Mrs. Wells." Robert made an appointment for that afternoon. He spent the time before the meeting rereading his property deed and the HOA documents Patricia had given him when he moved in. Nothing he could find mentioned anything about dock restrictions or forced community projects. Patricia's office was in the community center, a small building near the front entrance of the neighborhood. When Robert arrived, he was surprised to find 2 other board members there as well. Patricia introduced them as David, the treasurer, and Linda, the secretary. The atmosphere was much different from that friendly kitchen conversation a few months ago. "Robert, I'm glad you came in," Patricia said. but her smile seemed forced. "I know this change might come as a surprise, but we really believe it's for the best." "I don't understand," Robert said. "When you welcomed me to the neighborhood, you never mentioned any problems with my dock. Now suddenly it needs to be torn down?" David, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, pulled out a folder full of documents. "We've been studying this issue for over a year," he said. "The current system of individual docks creates safety hazards and aesthetic inconsistencies. Some docks are well-maintained, others are falling apart. Some people have boats, others don't. It's not fair to the community as a whole." "But my dock is in good condition," Robert protested. "I maintain it properly and it's not bothering anyone." Linda, a woman who looked to be in her 70s, shook her head. "It's not about individual cases, Mr. Chen. We need to think about the community's future. Property values, safety standards, environmental impact. A centralized marina system addresses all these concerns." Robert felt like he was in some kind of alternate reality. Environmental impact? My dock has been there for 20 years. If there were environmental problems, wouldn't they have shown up by now? Patricia leaned forward. "The Lake Association has new guidelines about wooden structures in the water. They're concerned about chemical treatments leaching into the lake ecosystem. The new community dock will use environmentally friendly materials. And everyone has to pay $15,000 for this? It's a significant investment," David admitted. "But when you divide the total cost among all the waterfront property owners, it's quite reasonable. You'll also have access to boat slips, a fish cleaning station, and covered storage for water equipment." Robert stood up. "What if I don't want those things? What if I'm perfectly happy with my own dock?" The three board members exchanged glances. Patricia's voice became firmer. "Robert, I understand this is an adjustment, but when you bought property in Blue Ridge Estates, you agreed to abide by HOA decisions. This isn't optional. I never agreed to have my dock torn down and pay $15,000 for something I don't want." Linda pulled out another document. "According to the HOA bylaws, section 12.4, the board has the authority to implement changes necessary for community welfare and property value maintenance. This falls squarely within our jurisdiction." Robert left the meeting feeling angry and confused. How had his peaceful retirement turned into this nightmare? He spent the evening calling other waterfront property owners to see how they felt about the new requirements. The responses were mixed. Some people, particularly those with older or damaged docks, seemed supportive of the idea. Others were just as upset as Robert. His neighbor Bill was furious. "They can't just force us to tear down our docks," he said over the phone. "I built mine with my own hands 15 years ago. It's perfectly safe and well-maintained." But other neighbors had different opinions. Mrs. Henderson, who lived 3 houses down, thought the community marina was a great idea. "My husband died 2 years ago and I can't maintain our dock anymore. It would be nice to have a community facility that someone else takes care of." Over the next week, Robert received 2 more certified letters. The first was a formal notice that he had 53 days remaining to comply with the dock removal requirement. The second was even more disturbing. It informed him that failure to comply would result in daily fines of $100, starting on day 61. Robert called the HOA office again, this time asking to speak directly to Patricia. When she finally called him back, her tone was professional but cold. "Robert, I hoped you'd had time to think about this rationally. The community has made its decision, and we need everyone to cooperate. Patricia, this doesn't seem right. You welcomed me to the neighborhood, and now you're threatening to fine me for having the same dock that was here when I bought the house. The board's responsibility is to the community as a whole, not to individual preferences. We can't make exceptions just because someone doesn't like a new policy. What if I refuse to pay the fine?" Patricia's voice became even colder. "Then we'll be forced to place a lien on your property. Robert, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just work with us." After hanging up, Robert sat on his dock and tried to process what was happening. The same people who had seemed so welcoming a few months ago were now threatening his home and his savings. The peaceful lake that had brought him so much joy was becoming the center of a battle he never wanted to fight. He watched the sun set behind the trees and wondered if he should just give in. Maybe it would be easier to pay the money and avoid the conflict. But something deep inside him rebelled against the idea. This was his home, his dock, his retirement dream. He wasn't going to let anyone take it away without a fight. Robert knew he needed professional help. The next morning, he drove into town and started calling law offices. Most of the lawyers he spoke with specialized in criminal law or personal injury cases. Finally, he found someone who dealt with property disputes and HOA conflicts. Attorney Jennifer Walsh had been practicing real estate law for 15 years. Her office was small but organized, with law books lining the walls and stacks of property documents on her desk. She listened carefully as Robert explained his situation, occasionally asking questions about the timeline and the specific language in the HOA letters. "This kind of thing is becoming more common," she said when Robert finished his story. "HOA boards sometimes get overzealous about their authority. The first thing I need to do is review all your property documents and the HOA bylaws. There might be restrictions on what they can actually force you to do." Jennifer asked Robert to bring her copies of his deed, the original property survey, his title insurance policy, and all the HOA documents he'd received. She also wanted copies of every letter and email related to the dock dispute. "This will take me a few days to review properly," she said. "But don't panic yet. HOAs have authority, but it's not unlimited. There are often protections for existing structures, especially if they were legal when they were built." Robert felt a little better leaving her office, but his relief was short-lived. When he got home, he found something that made his blood boil. Someone had placed bright orange traffic cones around his dock area, and there was a new sign posted on a metal stake near the water's edge. The sign read, "Waterfront area under community review. No unauthorized activity permitted. Blue Ridge Estates HOA." Robert immediately called the HOA office. This time, Patricia answered the phone herself. "You can't just put signs on my property," Robert said, trying to keep his voice calm. "The waterfront area is a community concern," Patricia replied. "We're simply marking areas that are under review for safety and compliance issues. Those cones are on my property. The sign is on my property. You have no right to put anything there without my permission. Robert, please calm down. This is temporary, just until we resolve the dock situation. We're trying to protect everyone's interests here." "Protect everyone's interests? You're harassing me for having a dock that's been there for 20 years. Patricia's voice became sharp. "We're following proper procedures. If you have a legal objection, you're welcome to pursue it through appropriate channels." After hanging up, Robert walked down to his dock and moved the cones to the edge of his property line. He also took photos of everything, including the sign and its exact location. Jennifer had told him to document everything that happened. That evening, Robert's phone rang. It was his neighbor, Bill. "Did you see what they did to Johnson's place?" Bill asked. Robert didn't know what he was talking about. Bill explained that Tom Johnson, who lived on the other side of the lake, had also refused to agree to the dock removal. That morning, HOA representatives had visited his property and placed similar cones and signs around his waterfront area. "They're trying to intimidate us," Bill said, "making it look like we're violating some kind of official order." The next day brought another unwelcome surprise. Robert received a letter from his homeowner's insurance company. Someone had contacted them claiming that his dock posed a safety hazard and might affect his liability coverage. The insurance company wanted to schedule an inspection. Robert called the insurance office and spoke with his agent, a woman named Carol who had handled his policy for 3 years. "I don't understand this," Carol said. "Your dock was included in the original property inspection when you bought the house. There weren't any problems then. Who reported a safety issue? I'm having a dispute with my homeowners association. I think they're trying to pressure me by involving my insurance," Carol sighed. "We have to investigate any safety complaints we receive. But honestly, this sounds like harassment. I'll schedule the inspection. But I'll also make a note in your file about the circumstances." The insurance inspector came out 2 days later. He was a friendly man who spent about 20 minutes examining the dock structure. He tested the stability of the posts, checked the condition of the wooden planks, and even measured the distance from the shore. "I don't see any problems here," he told Robert. "The dock is well maintained and structurally sound. Whoever reported this as a safety hazard was either mistaken or had other motives." But the harassment didn't stop there. The next week, Robert received a notice that his trash pickup would be suspended because his garbage cans were allegedly placed in the wrong location. When he checked the community guidelines, he found that his cans were exactly where they were supposed to be, in the same spot where he'd been placing them for months. Then came a citation for having unauthorized landscaping materials visible from the street. The violation referred to a small pile of mulch Robert had bought for his garden, which was temporarily stored beside his driveway. The mulch had been there for exactly 2 days. Robert was starting to feel like he was under siege in his own home. Every day brought some new complaint or citation. When he called the HOA office to dispute the citations, he was told that all complaints had to be submitted in writing and would be reviewed at the next board meeting, which was still 3 weeks away. Jennifer called with an update on her research. "I found some interesting things in your property documents," she said, "but I need to dig deeper into the county records. Some of the information doesn't match up with what the HOA has on file." "What kind of things?" "Property boundary descriptions mostly, and some references to water rights that aren't clearly explained in your deed. I want to get copies of the original surveys from when this development was first created." Meanwhile, the social pressure in the neighborhood was becoming uncomfortable. Robert noticed that some of his neighbors had started avoiding him. When he walked to his mailbox, people who used to wave and stop to chat would suddenly find reasons to go back inside their houses. But not everyone was against him. Bill remained supportive, and a few other neighbors quietly expressed their sympathy. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who lived across the street, stopped by one evening with a plate of cookies. "I think what they're doing to you is terrible," she said. "I don't have waterfront property, so this doesn't affect me directly. But the way they're treating you isn't right. If they can do this to you over a dock, what's to stop them from demanding something unreasonable from the rest of us?" Robert appreciated the support, but he was beginning to wonder if fighting the HOA was worth the stress. His peaceful retirement had turned into a daily battle. He wasn't sleeping well, his blood pressure was rising, and he found himself constantly worried about what new harassment would come next. The worst part was that his beautiful dock, the place that had brought him so much joy, now felt tainted by the conflict. Instead of relaxing there with his morning coffee, he found himself studying the waterfront area, looking for any new signs or cones that might have appeared overnight. One morning, Robert woke up to find that someone had been on his property during the night. New survey stakes had been placed around his dock area, apparently without his knowledge or permission. When he called the HOA office, he was told that they were conducting a boundary verification study and had the right to access waterfront areas for community safety purposes. "You can't just come onto my property whenever you want," Robert told Patricia during another heated phone call. "We're not on your property, Robert. We're surveying community water access areas. There's a difference. The stakes are in my yard 15 feet from the water. How is that not my property?" "That's exactly what we're trying to determine. The original property lines in this development may not be as clear as everyone thinks." After that conversation, Robert called Jennifer immediately. "They're claiming my property boundaries aren't clear. Can they do that?" "They can claim anything they want," Jennifer said. "But proving it is different. This actually ties into what I've been researching. Robert, I think I need to request the original development plans from the county. Something about this whole situation doesn't add up. And I'm starting to think the HOA might not have the authority they claim to have." That night, Robert sat on his dock despite everything that was happening. The lake was still beautiful. The sunset was still spectacular, and the water still lapped peacefully against the wooden posts. But now he couldn't help wondering how much longer he'd be able to enjoy this simple pleasure before the HOA found a way to take it away from him permanently. Jennifer called Robert on a Thursday morning, and her voice sounded different. Excited, maybe even a little shocked. "Robert, you need to come to my office right away. I've found something in the county records that changes everything." Robert drove to town faster than he probably should have. Jennifer's office was buzzing with activity when he arrived. Her desk was covered with old maps, survey documents, and photocopied papers that looked like they'd been pulled from dusty filing cabinets. "Sit down," Jennifer said, barely able to contain her excitement. "You're not going to believe what I discovered." She spread out a large yellowed map on her desk. It was clearly very old, with hand-drawn property lines and faded ink notations. "This is the original survey map from 1923, when Blue Ridge Lake was first developed," she explained. "I had to dig through 3 different county offices to find it, but look at this." She pointed to a section of the map that showed the lake and surrounding properties. Robert could see his house marked clearly, along with the distinctive curved shoreline that he knew so well. "According to this original survey, your property doesn't just include the house and yard. Look at these boundary markers. Jennifer traced a line with her finger that started at Robert's house and extended all the way to the water, but it didn't stop there. The line continued into the lake itself, then turned and followed the shoreline for what looked like several hundred feet. "I don't understand," Robert said. "What does this mean?" "It means you don't just own waterfront property, Robert. You own the actual waterfront. According to this survey, your property includes exclusive rights to the entire western shore of Blue Ridge Lake." Robert stared at the map, trying to process what he was seeing. That can't be right. Other people have houses along the water too. Jennifer pulled out another document. That's where it gets interesting. When the original developer sold lots in the 1920s, he divided the property in an unusual way. Most of the houses were sold with standard residential lots. But 3 properties, including yours, were sold with what's called riparian rights. Riparian rights? Water rights. Exclusive access to and control over specific sections of the shoreline. It's an old legal concept, but it's still valid today. Jennifer showed him more documents. Deed transfers, property descriptions, and legal surveys that painted a picture Robert never could have imagined. The community beach area where neighbors sometimes have gatherings. That's technically part of your property. The boat launch where people put in their kayaks. Also yours. And here's the really amazing part. She pulled out a modern survey map and overlaid it with the original 1923 map. The location where the HOA wants to build their new community marina? Right here, in the middle of your shoreline property. Robert felt like the room was spinning. Are you telling me that I own land I didn't even know about? Not just land. Water access rights that are probably worth more than your house. Robert, for the past 20 years, you've been unknowingly allowing the entire community to use your private waterfront. You could have legally restricted access at any time. Jennifer continued explaining what she'd discovered. The original property developer had been a wealthy businessman who wanted to maintain control over the lake's best fishing and swimming areas. So he'd structured the sales to keep riparian rights with only a few properties, while selling the other lots as standard residential parcels. The problem is that over the decades, the community started treating the waterfront as public space. People forgot about the original property boundaries. Even the HOA apparently doesn't realize they don't have authority over these areas. Robert looked at the survey maps again. If Jennifer was right, he didn't just own his dock. He owned the water access for nearly half the community. "How sure are you about this?" he asked. "I've triple-checked everything. I also called a friend who specializes in property law, and she confirmed my interpretation. These riparian rights are clearly documented and legally binding." Jennifer had also discovered why the HOA was able to get away with their aggressive tactics for so long. Most residents simply didn't know about the original property structure. The HOA had been operating under assumptions about community ownership that weren't legally accurate. "The really interesting thing," Jennifer continued, "is that the HOA has been collecting fees and making decisions about waterfront activities for years, apparently without having any actual authority over the areas they've been managing." Robert thought about all the times he'd seen neighbors using the beach area, launching boats and holding community events near the water. He'd always assumed they had as much right to be there as he did. What about the other properties with riparian rights? "There are 2 others. One belongs to an elderly man who moved to a nursing home 5 years ago. His family has been renting out the house, and the tenants probably have no idea about the water rights. The other property belongs to a couple who spend most of their time at a second home in Florida. I doubt they know what they own either." Jennifer explained that this kind of situation wasn't uncommon in older developments. Over time, people forgot about the original property structures, especially when they involved unusual rights like water access. "The question now is what you want to do with this information," she said. Robert was still trying to wrap his head around the implications. "What are my options?" "Well, legally you could restrict access to your waterfront areas immediately. You could charge the community for use of the boat launch and beach areas. You could stop the marina project completely, since they can't build it without your permission." Jennifer paused and looked at him seriously. "Or you could use this as leverage to negotiate a reasonable solution with the HOA. Robert thought about Patricia and the board members, how they'd treated him over the past few months. The threatening letters, the harassment, the attempts to intimidate him into compliance. "They've been trying to force me to pay $15,000 and tear down my dock," he said slowly, "all while using my property for community activities without my permission. That's about the size of it. Yes. Jennifer also explained the legal process they'd need to follow to establish Robert's rights officially. We'll need to have a professional survey done to confirm the exact boundaries. We'll also want to file a quiet title action to make sure there are no competing claims to the property. How long will that take? A few weeks for the survey, maybe a couple months for the legal paperwork. But Robert, you don't necessarily need to wait for all that to be finished before you start negotiating with the HOA. Robert looked out Jennifer's office window at the busy street below. A few months ago, his biggest concern had been whether the fish were biting. Now he was dealing with property rights, legal surveys, and HOA disputes. There's one more thing, Jennifer said. I think we should keep this discovery confidential for now. If the HOA finds out what you actually own before we're ready to negotiate, they might try to create new problems or claim that the original surveys are invalid. Robert agreed. He needed time to think about how to handle this information. The drive back to Blue Ridge Lake felt surreal. Every landmark looked different now that he understood what he actually owned. When he got home, Robert walked down to his dock and looked at the waterfront with new eyes. The beach area where children built sand castles, the boat launch where neighbors put in their kayaks, the swimming area where teenagers jumped off the old wooden platform. All of it was his. He thought about Patricia and the board members, so confident in their authority, so dismissive of his rights. They had no idea that they'd been making demands of the person who actually controlled the very areas they wanted to regulate. For the first time since this whole mess started, Robert smiled. The tables were about to turn, and he was going to enjoy watching the HOA's reaction when they learned who really ruled the docks. Robert spent the weekend thinking about how to handle his newfound knowledge. Jennifer had advised him to be strategic rather than emotional, but part of him wanted to march into the next HOA meeting and watch Patricia's face when she learned the truth. Instead, he decided to follow Jennifer's advice and wait for the professional survey to be completed. But first, he wanted to document everything properly. He took detailed photos of all the areas that were apparently his property, including the community beach, the boat launch, and the exact location where the HOA planned to build their marina. On Monday morning, Robert called Jennifer to discuss strategy. I've been thinking about this all weekend, he said. I don't want to be vindictive, but I also don't want them to think they can just sweep this under the rug. What did you have in mind? I want to give them a chance to do the right thing, but I want to make it clear that I know exactly what's going on and I'm not going to be pushed around anymore. Jennifer agreed that a measured approach would be best. Let's wait for the survey results, then request a meeting with the full board. We'll present the facts calmly and professionally and see how they respond. The survey took 2 weeks to complete. The results confirmed everything Jennifer had found in the county records. Robert's property included 847 feet of Blue Ridge Lake shoreline, encompassing all the areas the community had been using for decades. Meanwhile, the HOA continued their harassment campaign. Robert received another certified letter informing him that his compliance deadline was approaching and that daily fines would begin in just 5 days. There was also a new citation for unauthorized waterfront signage and apparently referring to a small private property sign that Robert had placed near his dock. Jennifer called Patricia's office and requested a meeting with the full HOA board for the following Thursday evening. She didn't explain what the meeting was about, only that it concerned important property boundary information related to the waterfront development project. Robert was nervous as Thursday approached. He'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, but he still wasn't sure how the board would react to the news. Jennifer had advised him to let her do most of the talking, at least initially. The meeting was held in the community center conference room. Patricia was there, along with David the treasurer, Linda the secretary, and 2 other board members Robert didn't recognize. The atmosphere was formal and somewhat tense. Mr. Chen, Patricia began, I hope this meeting means you're ready to discuss a reasonable resolution to the dock situation. Jennifer opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. Actually, Mrs. Wells, we're here to discuss something quite different. We've discovered some important information about property boundaries that affects the entire waterfront development project. She spread out the survey maps on the conference table. The board members looked confused as Jennifer began explaining what she'd found in the county records. According to the original 1923 survey, and confirmed by a recent professional survey, Mr. Chen's property includes riparian rights to the entire western shore of Blue Ridge Lake. Patricia frowned. I don't understand what you're saying. Jennifer pointed to the maps. I'm saying that the community beach area, the boat launch, and the location where you're planning to build the marina are all part of Mr. Chen's private property. The room went completely silent. David picked up one of the maps and studied it closely, his face growing pale. That's impossible, Patricia said. The HOA has been managing these areas for 20 years. Managing them, yes. But not owning them, Jennifer replied. The community has been using Mr. Chen's property with his unknowing permission. But legally, he has exclusive rights to these waterfront areas. Linda, the secretary, spoke up. Even if that's true, there must be some kind of adverse possession claim. The community has been using these areas openly for decades. Jennifer had anticipated this argument. Adverse possession requires that the use be hostile to the owner's interests. But Mr. Chen and previous owners have been allowing community use. That's not hostile. That's permissive use, which doesn't create any ownership rights for the community. Robert watched the board members' faces as the reality of the situation sank in. Patricia looked like she was about to be sick. David was frantically shuffling through papers, apparently trying to find something that would contradict what Jennifer was telling them. This is ridiculous, Patricia finally said. We have HOA authority over common areas and community facilities. You have authority over areas that actually belong to the HOA, Jennifer corrected. But these waterfront areas were never deeded to the community. They've remained private property all along. Jennifer then pulled out copies of all the threatening letters Robert had received, along with documentation of the harassment campaign. For the past several months, the HOA has been demanding that Mr. Chen remove his dock from his own property and pay $15,000 toward a marina project that would be built on his land without his permission. Robert could see that the other board members were starting to understand the legal implications. If Jennifer was right, and the survey seemed to prove she was, the HOA had been operating outside their authority for years. What exactly are you asking for? David said quietly. Jennifer looked at Robert, who nodded for her to continue. Mr. Chen wants a reasonable resolution that respects his property rights, while acknowledging the community's long-term use of these areas. First, all fines and citations related to his dock must be rescinded immediately. Second, the HOA must publicly acknowledge that they don't have authority over private waterfront areas. Patricia started to object, but Jennifer continued. Third, Mr. Chen is willing to grant the community continued access to the beach and boat launch areas, under a formal agreement that clearly establishes his ownership while allowing reasonable community use in the marina project, Linda asked. That would require Mr. Chen's permission since it would be built on his property. He's open to discussion, but the current demand that he pay for construction on his own land is obviously unacceptable. The board members exchanged glances. Robert could tell they were realizing how badly they'd mishandled the situation. We'll need time to review these documents with our attorney, Patricia said. Of course, Jennifer replied. But understand that Mr. Chen could legally restrict all community access to these areas immediately if he chose to. He's being generous by offering continued use under a formal agreement. After the meeting, Robert felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction. The look on Patricia's face when she realized what the HOA had actually been doing was worth all the stress of the past few months. Jennifer called him 2 days later with news. The HOA's attorney confirmed everything we presented. They want to schedule another meeting to discuss the details of a formal agreement. The second meeting was much different in tone. Patricia was noticeably subdued, and David did most of the talking for the board. They agreed to rescind all fines and citations against Robert immediately. They also agreed to remove the orange cones and signs from his property. Most importantly, they agreed to draft a formal access agreement that would allow continued community use of the beach and boat launch areas, while clearly establishing Robert's ownership and control. As for the marina project, Robert surprised everyone by agreeing to allow construction to proceed, but under completely different terms. Instead of demanding payment from him, the HOA would pay him a reasonable lease fee for use of his waterfront property. The marina would be built to his specifications, and he would have guaranteed access to boat slips for himself and his guests. The final agreement was signed 3 weeks later. By then, Word had spread throughout the community about what had actually happened. Some neighbors were embarrassed about how Robert had been treated. Others were grateful that he'd been reasonable about allowing continued access to the waterfront areas. Patricia Wells resigned as HOA president shortly after the agreement was signed. The new board was much more collaborative and less aggressive in their approach to community management. Robert's life returned to the peaceful routine he'd originally envisioned. He was back to enjoying his morning coffee on the dock, watching sunrises and spending quiet afternoons reading by the water. The difference was that now he fully understood and appreciated what he owned. The community marina was completed the following spring. It was beautiful, well designed, and included all the amenities the HOA had originally promised. The difference was that Robert didn't have to pay for it. Instead, the lease payments actually provided him with a nice supplement to his retirement income. On warm evenings, Robert often sat on his dock and watched families playing on the beach that was technically his property. Children built sandcastles, teenagers learned to water ski, and couples walked hand in hand along the shoreline. He was glad he'd chosen to share rather than restrict, even though the law would have supported either decision. Bill, his fishing buddy, often joined him for these evening observations. "You handled that whole situation perfectly," he said one night as they watched the sunset paint the lake golden. "You could have been a lot less generous." Robert smiled and cast his line into the calm water. "I never wanted to be the lake dictator," he said. "I just wanted them to treat me with respect." "Well, you certainly got that," Bill laughed. "I don't think anyone in this community will ever underestimate the quiet guy with the simple dock again." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Robert reflected on how dramatically his life had changed over the past year. He'd come to Blue Ridge Lake looking for peace and quiet, and he'd found both, but not before learning that sometimes you have to fight for the things that matter most. The dock beneath his feet was still the same weathered wooden structure he'd fallen in love with when he first saw the property, but now it represented something more than just a place to fish and watch sunsets. It was a symbol of his determination to stand up for his rights and his willingness to find reasonable solutions even in difficult situations. Robert had learned that he truly did rule the docks at Blue Ridge Lake, but more importantly, he'd learned that real power comes from knowing when to use your authority and when to show mercy. The lake was big enough for everyone, and there was more than enough peace and beauty to go around.